They didn't say it to her face. They whispered it behind hymnals, in the corners of the bakery, over the fences between yards. A teacher without children of her own, they'd say, with polite pity curled around the edges. How could she ever understand? Margaret Bell heard it all, and every morning she still rang the bell outside the one-room schoolhouse, as if her heart weren't bruised from years of trying. 35, unmarried, and without a child to her name, she carried the weight of every birth announcement and every quiet glance as if they were stones in her apron. She taught multiplication and handwriting with a smile, corrected boys who shoved and girls who slouched. But each time she faced the row of desks, one always stood out. The one that stayed empty when a child was pulled from school to work the fields, or vanished with a traveling family, or died in a fevered sleep. That emptiness echoed inside her. She didn't speak of the letters she kept folded in her nightstand, test results and doctor notes from years ago, words like unlikely and incomplete. The town didn't know. They didn't ask. They just saw a woman who walked alone, lived alone, and had no one to chase through the chapel aisles. Until the day the fire came. The orphanage 3 miles east caught before dawn. Dry wood, strong wind, and no water fast enough to stop it. By the time word reached town, the building was ash and smoke. The Reverend announced it during morning prayers, voice trembling. 10 children, with nowhere to go. The church fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Until Margaret stood up. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. They'll come with me. Eyes turned. I've got space. The school has benches. My house has beds. The mayor frowned. You're not their kin. I'm their teacher, she said, and if no one else will claim them, I will. Later, they tried to talk her down. Too many mouths, too much work. But she was already sweeping the schoolhouse floor, clearing corners, laying blankets beneath the windows. When the wagon arrived with soot-covered children, some crying, some silent, all lost, Margaret didn't flinch. She greeted each one by name, knelt to meet their eyes, and took their tiny hands as if they'd always been hers. That night, as 10 small bodies slept on her classroom floor, Margaret sat beside the fire, alone but not lonely. For the first time, the desk in her heart wasn't empty. It was full, overflowing, and the town would never whisper the same way again. By morning, the schoolhouse no longer smelled of chalk and paper. It smelled of wood smoke, milk, and a dozen soft breaths warming the corners of the room. Margaret hadn't slept. Not really. She'd spent the night tucking coats around bare feet, wiping noses, and whispering lullabies that once lived only in her dreams. When the children woke, hungry and hesitant, she had hot porridge ready and bowls lined up like soldiers awaiting duty. They didn't ask where their beds were. They didn't cry for toys. They just ate, quiet and careful, watching her the way a deer watches a still hand, unsure but hopeful. By noon, word had spread. The mayor came first, standing in the doorway with arms folded like the school was suddenly his. They can't stay here forever, he said flatly. You're not an institution. Margaret straightened. Number, I'm not. I'm a woman with a roof, food, and hands that know how to hold broken things together. There are protocols, he insisted. State requirements, guardianship filings. Then I'll file them, she replied, and until the ink dries, they stay with me. He left, shaking his head, muttering something about bleeding hearts and empty pockets. But that night, a loaf of bread appeared at her doorstep, then a sack of beans, then a jar of honey with no note. The town watched, unsure how to label her anymore. Not a spinster, not just a school teacher. Something else, something harder to dismiss. The children changed too. Peter, who hadn't spoken since the fire, drew a picture of her with 10 stick-figure children. Ruth, who flinched at raised voices, began humming while sweeping. Margaret didn't teach lessons that week. Instead, she taught them how to mend socks, how to boil water safely, how to braid hair and scrub floors. Not punishment, belonging. She let them feel useful, wanted, seen. One afternoon, as she carried firewood inside, she heard giggling. The girls had lined up the boys in a row and were pretending to teach, imitating Margaret's posture, voice, and even the way she adjusted her glasses. They weren't mocking her. They were becoming her. Later, she found a scrap of paper on her pillow. Scrawled in a child's hand were 4 words. "You're the mama now." She sat on the edge of her cot, the paper trembling in her hand. Not because it hurt, because it healed. They didn't come from her, but they belonged to her now. And every whisper that once broke her had turned into a voice louder than any town's judgment, one that called her mother without needing to be asked. 3 weeks passed, and not once did Margaret Bell eat alone. Her table, once quiet enough to hear every tick of the mantel clock, was now a symphony of clattering spoons, giggles between bites, and stories only half finished before someone interrupted with something sillier. At night, she still cooked in silence, but it was a warm kind of silence, one filled with tiny feet pattering across floorboards, mismatched socks lost under cots, and whispered secrets exchanged in corners. The town no longer asked if she was serious. They asked if she needed more blankets, more bread, more help. Some did it out of guilt, some out of awe. But no one could deny what they saw when they passed the schoolhouse. Children sweeping steps before lessons, boys hauling firewood taller than themselves, and Margaret, never raising her voice, just nodding, guiding, teaching. Then came the letter, sealed with a state crest, delivered by stagecoach. A caseworker was coming. To determine placement, it read, to evaluate her fitness as caretaker. Margaret read it once, then again. Her chest tightened, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. What if they took the children away? What if this fragile thing she'd built, their laughter, their healing, their trust, wasn't enough on paper? That night, she told the children the truth. No lies, no sugar. "Someone is coming," she said gently. "They'll ask questions, and they may decide, this can't last." A silence fell so thick it muffled the fire's crackle. Then little Ruth stood, fists clenched. "But this is our school now." "They can't take back love," Peter added. "You didn't buy us. You chose us." Margaret swallowed hard. "I will fight for you," she whispered. "Even if they don't understand." The morning of the visit, she scrubbed every inch of the schoolhouse. The children wore their cleanest clothes, some too short, some patched. But they stood proud, lined up like a chorus of belonging. The caseworker arrived just past noon. A man in spectacles with a clipboard and the stiff air of someone who had never stepped inside a one-room school on a muddy hill. He asked his questions. Margaret answered each one without flinching, about hygiene, curriculum, discipline. But when he asked, "Do you feel you can fulfill the emotional needs of 10 children without ever having had your own?" Margaret stood tall. "Sir, not one of these children came from me, but each one now knows what it feels like to be safe, fed, heard, and held. If that isn't motherhood, you'll have to tell me what is." He said nothing, just scribbled and left. But the children ran to her then, no longer asking if she could keep them. They already knew. No desk in her school would be empty again, nor would the space beside her heart. The caseworker never returned. No letter followed, No order, no removal. And so Margaret stitched. She needed to do something with her hands, to hold still the joy and fear swirling through her chest like a storm. One evening, she spread an old cotton sheet across the schoolroom floor, gathered scraps from her worn dresses, the children's outgrown sleeves, and even strips of cloth from a retired school flag. "What are you making?" Ruth asked. "A record," Margaret replied. "Of what?" "Of who we are now." One by one, the children came forward. She cut a square for each of them. Peter's came from a shirt he once wore when he refused to speak. Ruth's from a ribbon she clung to when she had nightmares. Margaret even cut a piece from her own apron, frayed but strong, stained with ink and flour and love. As they stitched together, she taught them how to thread needles, how to loop and pull. It became their nightly ritual, lessons by lantern light, the hum of needles through cloth, and a silence filled not with loneliness, but purpose. One square at a time, the quilt grew. And on each piece, they embroidered names, not just their own, but the ones they'd given each other. Mama Bell was stitched in bold blue thread across the center. That name hadn't been spoken in public yet. But inside these walls, it had become law. When the quilt was finally done, they hung it behind the chalkboard like a flag. Children who once had nothing now had a banner of belonging. Then winter arrived. Snow dusted the roof, crept into cracks, and quieted the outside world. Margaret rationed carefully, lit fires earlier, and wrapped the little ones in layers before breakfast. One morning she woke to find a note slipped under the door. No signature, just 6 words. "We see what you're doing here." With it, a small pouch of coins. Another followed the next week, and another. Someone was watching, not to judge, but to support silently. Margaret never asked who. She just whispered, "Thank you," and bought more blankets. Then one night, after the children had gone to sleep, she pulled the quilt over her lap and traced the stitches with her fingers. Every knot, every line, it wasn't perfect. Some letters tilted, some threads frayed. But it was theirs, a record of survival, of becoming. And as the wind howled outside, Margaret knew the truth. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were rooted, named, sewn into something no law could unravel. It was a Thursday when the knock came. 2 short taps, hesitant, like someone unsure if they were welcome. Margaret had just finished ladling stew into bowls, the children lined up with spoons already in hand. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Harper from the dry goods store standing with a bundle in her arms. "I didn't know what size," she said quickly, eyes darting behind Margaret to glimpse the room full of children, "so I brought wool, not boots, wool stretches." She handed over 3 folded blankets, then turned to leave without waiting for thanks. Margaret stood for a moment, stunned. Then Ruth whispered, "She used to say orphans were a burden." "Now she's cold," Peter said, "and we're warm." They giggled, not cruelly, but in that innocent way children do when they realize the world is beginning to turn in their favor. The next morning, a knock again. This time it was Mr. Lyle, the gruff blacksmith with arms like iron beams. He said nothing, just passed Margaret a sack of flour and muttered, "Can't let kids go hungry. That ain't decent." Margaret thanked him, but he was already walking away, the snow crunching beneath his boots like applause. And still, the knocks kept coming. Miss Weller from the dress shop brought patches and buttons. The widow Barnes donated 2 feather pillows, and the gravedigger, of all people, offered firewood. "Better used for life than death," he'd said, rubbing his hands together. Each knock wasn't just a gift. It was a quiet confession. "We were wrong about you." The children noticed, too. Their posture shifted. Where once they hunched to hide their orphan shame, now they walked taller, eager to carry logs, sweep steps, write neatly. At the town's winter fair, no one had invited them. But Margaret led them anyway, cloaks patched, boots too big, heads high. And when they passed the mayor, the same man who once questioned her fitness, he removed his hat and gave a nod. "Evening, Miss Bell. Fine work you've done." She smiled politely. "Thank you, Mayor, but I haven't done it alone." That night, the children built snowmen outside the schoolhouse, while Margaret watched from the porch. For the first time, she wasn't wondering how long it would last. It was lasting, because something had changed, not in the law books or newspapers, but in hearts. The same town that once whispered now warmed her doorstep with kindness, and in every bowl of stew, every hand-sewn mitten, and every knock on her door, Margaret heard what no official ever wrote down. "You are their mother, and they are ours too." It was a cold morning in February when Margaret reached for the chalk, and it snapped clean in her hand. It was just a small thing, a quiet thing, but the sound echoed through the schoolroom like a crack in glass. 10 children sat in silence, books open, pencils poised. Peter looked up first. "You okay, Mama Bell?" The name still made her chest ache, not from pain but from the weight of what it meant now. "I'm fine," she said softly, brushing the broken piece into her palm. But the truth sat heavy in her throat. Supplies were running thin. The generosity had slowed as the novelty wore off. Winter dragged on, crueler than the last. And though the children never complained, Margaret knew how far she was stretching things. Firewood was low. The chickens hadn't laid in days. She hadn't eaten a full portion in over a week. That afternoon, she sent the children out to play and sat at her desk, staring at the chalk tray with its worn stubs and broken ends. She felt foolish for crying over it. But sometimes it wasn't the big things that broke you. It was the little ones that piled up quietly. Then came the second knock. Not at the door, but on the glass. She looked up. There stood Anna May, the town's wealthiest widow. Fur-lined coat, lace gloves, eyes soft but unreadable. Margaret opened the door, trying not to let the cold or her pride slip through. "Miss Bell," Anna said gently, "I'd like to sit in on your lesson tomorrow. If that's allowed." Margaret blinked. "Why?" "Because I think I forgot what real learning looks like, and I think I'd like to remember." The next day, Anna sat in the back row. She watched Margaret teach fractions with bits of bread, grammar through story songs, and geography by drawing rivers from memory. When the children sang the state anthem, Margaret's voice lifted too, not because she felt strong, but because they needed her to. After class, Anna pulled her aside. "You've taught them more than letters. You've taught them to believe they matter." She handed Margaret a sealed envelope. Inside was a check, enough to get them through the winter, and then some. Margaret clutched it in both hands, knees weakening. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you broke the chalk," Anna replied, smiling, "but not your will." That night, Margaret lit the fire higher, served second helpings, and passed out new pencils, each sharpened to a perfect point. And for the first time in weeks, she slept. Not because the struggle was over, but because she knew it wasn't hers alone anymore. Margaret hadn't entered the church in over a year. Not since the town first whispered behind her back that a woman who bore no children couldn't possibly understand the hearts of the ones in her care. Not since she'd heard her name mentioned in the wrong tone between pews, but on Easter Sunday she arrived. Not to prove anything, not to be seen, just to sit. The children dressed in their best, Peter with a crooked tie, Ruth with a ribbon sewn onto a borrowed bonnet. They filed into the chapel like they belonged, because Margaret had taught them that they did. She sat near the back, as always, hands folded in her lap. The pastor spoke of rebirth, of second chances, of love unearned but given anyway. Margaret's eyes drifted to the rows ahead. Families bundled in their Sunday best, mothers with babies on their hips, fathers shifting uncomfortably in too tight collars. Then a child's voice rang out, clear and unexpected. "That's her! Mama Bell!" Every head turned. It was Ruth, standing halfway up the aisle, pointing at Margaret with no shame and a full smile. Margaret's heart leapt to her throat. For a moment, time froze. Then, something changed. The woman beside Ruth, Mrs. Carter, whose bakery had once refused Margaret credit, stood slowly and offered a nod. "She teaches my niece," she said, voice steady, "and does it better than I ever could." A man near the front murmured, "She took in the ones we wouldn't, fed them when no one else did." The pastor smiled. "Then I believe we should thank her." And without fanfare, the congregation turned, not all at once, but enough. They nodded. They smiled. Some even clapped. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest. Not pride, not attention, just recognition. The sermon continued. The songs were sung, but something sacred had already happened, without ceremony, without decree. That afternoon the children picked wildflowers on the hill and presented them to her in a tin bucket. "What's this for?" she asked. "Because everyone else thanked you today," Peter said, "but we wanted to do it first." Margaret didn't cry, not in front of them. But later, when the schoolhouse had gone quiet and the children were asleep in their mismatched beds, she placed that bucket on her desk and whispered, "Thank you for letting me be yours." She had once believed her life was defined by what she lacked. Now she saw it was built by what she gave. And nothing, not whispers, not rules, not years of silence, could ever take that away. Spring brought more than warmth. It brought letters. The first was from the state, a single page, stamped and signed. Approved for permanent guardianship of all 10 children. Margaret read it twice, then again, holding it like something sacred. She didn't run to tell the children right away. She stood there in the doorway of the schoolhouse, the paper trembling in her hand, staring out at the hill where they chased one another with ribbon tails and laughter. It had never been about keeping them. It had always been about giving them a place where no one else tried to take them away. That evening, she gathered them on the steps. No formality, no big words. Just the truth. "You're mine now, legally, completely." For a beat, no one moved. Then the cheer went up, raw and full-throated and clumsy, with hugs and tears and dancing in circles. Little Thomas clung to her waist and said, "Even if I'm bad sometimes?" She knelt. "Especially then." The second letter arrived a week later, from a nearby town, an invitation to speak at their new teachers' association. "We've heard of your work," it said. "Your school, your story." Margaret smiled at the word your. They had once questioned if she belonged here at all. Now they wanted to learn from her. She didn't go for pride. She went because maybe, somewhere, another woman was sitting alone in a quiet classroom, wondering if she'd missed her chance at motherhood. Maybe her words could reach her. As May ripened, the schoolhouse grew louder with joy. The children planted flowers, painted slates, and memorized poems about seeds and sky. One morning, Peter tugged her sleeve. "Do you miss anything? From before us?" Margaret thought for a long time. "No," she said at last. "Only that it took this long to find you." They surprised her for her birthday. She hadn't told them when it was, but they knew, somehow, 10 handmade cards, 1 wooden bell carved from scraps, a cake made with too much salt but eaten down to crumbs. That night, she sat beneath the stars, the quilt across her lap, The door opened behind her, where the sound of soft breathing rose like a hymn. The wind had changed. Not because she'd chased it, but because she'd held still when everyone else walked away. That was the power of love, not born from blood, but from choice, from courage, from chalk, porridge, bruised hands, and boundless belief. And now the wind no longer carried whispers. It carried her name, not as a woman who had nothing, but as the mother who gave everything. It was nearly summer when the new boy appeared, barefoot, dust-coated, and silent. He stood at the edge of the schoolyard, as if he wasn't sure whether he was welcome or even real. Margaret was gathering the children for morning lessons when she spotted him. He didn't run when she approached, just stared with hollow eyes that had already seen too much. "What's your name?" she asked gently. He didn't answer. His feet were cracked, his shirt torn at both shoulders. Margaret turned to Ruth and Peter. "Bring water, and one of the apples from the jar." No questions. They ran. She knelt and tried again. "Do you have anyone?" He shook his head. "Where did you come from?" He pointed vaguely towards the west road. "How long have you been alone?" The silence stretched, then, "Since the fire." 3 words. Enough. Margaret stood slowly and held out her hand. "You're not alone anymore." He didn't take it, not yet. But he followed her back to the schoolhouse, where the children watched with wide eyes. They didn't ask who he was. They'd all been him once. Peter gave him his second shirt. Ruth placed a blanket at the end of her cot. That afternoon the boy sat in the back row and said nothing. But when Margaret handed him a slate and a stub of chalk, he wrote one word in careful, crooked letters. Adam. That night, Margaret lit an extra lamp and pulled an extra bowl from the cupboard. She made stew with the last of the carrots and saved the biggest portion for Adam. When he finished, he looked up at her and asked, "Are you the one they talk about?" "Who?" "The teacher who takes the ones no one wants." Her breath caught. "Is that what they say?" "They said you make them family." Margaret walked over, knelt again beside him, and whispered, "That's not what I do. That's who they already are." He nodded once, solemn, and finished his stew. Later, when the other children slept, Adam crept to the quilt that hung behind the desk and stared at it in silence. Margaret watched from the doorway. "We'll stitch your name in tomorrow," she said softly. "If you'd like." He turned to her with wide eyes. "Can I choose where it goes?" She smiled. "Of course." He pointed to a patch near the center, just beneath Mama Bell. "There," he said. "I want to be close." And with that he curled up beside the fire and slept as if he'd never done so before. With safety. With a future. With a name sewn into something no one could ever take from him again. The final day of the school year came with wildflowers and sun-warmed dirt. The children had strung ribbons across the fence, their laughter echoing down the hill, bright and free. Margaret stood on the porch with the bell in her hand, the same one she'd rung every morning for years, once to empty desks and quiet judgment. Now, the yard overflowed with noise and life. She let them play longer that day. There were no tests, no chalkboard lessons, just stories and songs, paper crowns and bare feet in the grass. Adam sat in the middle of them now, no longer the silent boy at the edge. His name was stitched into the quilt, just like the others, each square uneven, each letter a little crooked, but all part of something whole. When the sun began to dip, Margaret called them inside. The desks had been scrubbed clean, every slate stacked neatly. On the center desk sat a pile of letters, each one written by a child in their own hand, sealed and addressed to Mama Bell. She opened the first one. "Thank you for making me feel real." The second, I want to be like you when I grow up. The third, you were the first person who waited for me to speak. She didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she reached into the drawer and pulled out a roll of twine and 10 tiny bells. We're going to make something, she said. They didn't know what at first, but soon they understood. Each child strung a bell. Then they helped her tie them across the porch beam, one for every child who had ever passed through her door, lost and unclaimed. These are for the ones who arrived in silence, she said, but left knowing they belonged. That night, as the stars blinked awake, Margaret sat on the step, the children huddled around her in blankets and yawns. The wind passed through the trees, caught the porch beam, and set the bells to singing, soft, uneven, perfectly out of tune. What do they mean? Peter asked. Margaret smiled, pulling the quilt tighter around them all. They mean we made it. The town never built a monument for her. There were no headlines, no medals. But when strangers passed through and asked, "Who takes care of all these children?" they were told one name every time. Not Miss Bell, not the school teacher, just Mama. And as long as those bells rang in the wind, her story would never be forgotten. Because in a one-room schoolhouse on a hill, a woman once mocked for having no children gave 10 of them the world. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more redemptive frontier stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been in that town, would you have stood with her or whispered like the others? Tell us in the comments below.